Nobody talks about the forge. They talk about the buildings. They talk about the impossible architecture. The doorways no living human would ever need to be that tall. The ceilings vaulting up into spaces that serve no function if the people using them stand 6 feet or under. They talk about the mud flood, the buried cities, the photographs of first-floor windows that are now halfway underground, the staircases that lead from street level down into what used to be an entrance hall. They talk about the maps, the old maps, the ones that show Tartary stretching across the top of the world in a mass so enormous it makes every empire you were ever taught to consider dominant look like a minor provincial territory. They talk about all of it, and they should, because all of it is evidence. All of it is the residue of something that has been deliberately removed from the story of this world. But nobody talks about the forge. Nobody asks what it would mean practically, functionally, to manufacture tools and structures and implements for beings whose hands were the size of a grown man's torso. Nobody asks who did that work, or how, or what the relationship between the makers and the made for actually looked like over the generations during which it functioned. Nobody asks what was lost when it ended, or what the last person to perform that function understood about what they were doing and why. This is the story of what happened at the end, the very end, the final months of the covenant between the human smiths and the giants they served, told from the inside, from the forge itself, from the last man who stood at it and knew what he was standing at, and it is the story of what the giant told him before they came with the chains. To get there, we have to start somewhere further back. Not all the way back, not to the origin of the thing, because the origin of the thing reaches into a past so deep that the fragments we have access to cannot fully illuminate it. But far enough back to understand the shape of what existed before the erasure. Far enough back to understand what Tartaria actually was, at its functioning height, before the people who could not tolerate its existence decided that it needed to be unmade. Tartaria was not a place in the sense that most people use that word. That is the first confusion to clear up, and it is a confusion that has been carefully cultivated by the people who needed it to be a confusion. On the old maps, on the maps that existed before the great revision of geographic and historical knowledge that accompanied the political restructuring of the early modern period, Tartary is labelled as a territory, a region, a place you could point to and say, that is where Tartaria is. Over there, east of this, north of that, within these rough and shifting borders. But that labelling is itself already a reduction. Already a simplification that the people doing the labelling were either unable or unwilling to look past. What the maps are pointing at when they point at Tartary is not a territory in the way that France is a territory or Russia is a territory. What the maps are pointing at is the visible edge of something much larger and much older, a civilization so extensive that the European cartographers who were mapping it had no conceptual framework for what they were looking at, and so they drew the borders they could see and labelled the thing within those borders with a name that had been in use for long enough that it felt like a known quantity. It was not a known quantity. It was not even close to a known quantity. The civilization those maps were gesturing toward without fully representing extended at its operational height across more of the Earth's surface than any model of ancient or pre-modern civilization that official history has ever proposed. The architectural evidence alone, the buildings that survive in the physical world regardless of what the textbooks say about them, establishes presence on every inhabited continent. The structural vocabulary is consistent, the scale is consistent, the materials and the engineering principles and the decorative grammar are consistent in ways that should be impossible if these structures were produced by unconnected populations working independently with no knowledge of each other. They were not unconnected populations working independently. They were expressions in different locations and different local variations of a single civilizational tradition. A tradition that understood the world differently than we have been taught to understand it, that built for different purposes than we have been told those buildings served, and that operated in relationship with beings whose existence official history has decided is easier to deny than to explain. The giants. The skeletal record exists. This is not a matter of interpretation or disputed methodology. The skeletal record of anomalously large human form remains has been documented, photographed, reported in contemporaneous newspaper accounts, shipped to institutions, and then quietly made unavailable for public study with a consistency and a thoroughness that is itself more explanatory than any individual instance of disappearance. You do not systematically suppress evidence of things that are not real. The suppression is the confirmation. The scale and the organization and the long-term institutional commitment of the suppression effort tells you more clearly than any of the individual artifacts could tell you that what is being suppressed is something that the suppressors understand to be genuinely threatening to the story they have decided the world needs to believe. What is being suppressed is this. At some point in the past that official history has filled with a narrative of gradual human development from primitive origins toward the magnificent achievement of modern civilization, there were beings on this earth who were not human in scale, beings who were humanoid in form, who possessed intelligence and social organization, and something that we would recognize as culture, but who were physically of a size that placed them in a different relationship to the world than human beings occupy. Beings for whom the architecture that leaves us puzzled today was not puzzling at all, because it was built to their proportions for their use by the civilization of which they were a part, and alongside those beings in a relationship that the fragments of oral tradition that survived the erasure describe with consistent emotional texture across cultures that official history insists were entirely isolated from each other. There were human beings, smaller, more numerous, gifted in ways that the giants were not, limited in ways that the giants were not, and locked into a relationship with those giants that was neither simple nor one-sided. A relationship that had evolved over enough time and through enough mutual adjustment that it had acquired the quality of a covenant. The covenant had many expressions, but its deepest and most sacred expression, the one that the oral traditions remember with the greatest specificity and the greatest reverence, was the relationship between the giants and the smiths. Understand what the forge meant in the world before this world. Understand that the smith was not a tradesman in any sense that our contemporary concept of skilled labour would recognize. The smith was the one who understood fire. The smith was the one who had mastered the transformation of raw matter into something that raw matter could never be on its own. The smith stood at the place where the natural world ended and the made world began, and the knowledge the smith carried was knowledge of how to move things from one side of that border to the other. This was understood in every tradition that retained any memory of what the forge actually was as a sacred function. Not sacred in the way that modern people often use that word as a synonym for respected or important. Sacred in the technical sense, set apart, belonging to a category of activity that ordinary human beings could approach but not enter, could benefit from but not perform, could honor but not replicate without the lineage and the training and the particular quality of attention that the tradition required. In Tartaria, the sacred function of the smith had a specific and extraordinary application. The beings who needed the things that smiths made were not all the same size. The giants could build. The scale of Tartarian architecture makes this obvious. The organizational capacity, the logistical sophistication, the structural understanding that those buildings represent, none of that could have been achieved without beings of considerable intelligence working in coordinated effort over extended time. The giants built. They quarried and transported and raised and fitted stone at scales that human beings working alone could not have managed. They were builders, but they were not smiths. Not in the sense that mattered. Not in the sense of the finest work, the intricate work, the work that requires a human hand operating at human scale to achieve the precision that the function demands. The giant hand, for all its power, for all the tasks it was suited to, could not perform the delicate manipulation that metalwork at its highest level requires, could not draw wire, could not fit a hinge to a tolerance measured in fractions, could not produce the ornamental detail, the functional precision, the interlocking components of mechanisms designed to move and lock and release with exactness. For that, they needed human hands, and so the arrangement existed. not as exploitation, not as the relationship of a powerful being to a lesser one pressed into service. The traditions are consistent on this point, and consistency across unconnected oral traditions is about as close to certainty as historical reconstruction gets. The arrangement was one of genuine mutual regard. The giants brought things to the relationship that human communities could not have provided for themselves, things that went beyond the obvious physical scale. Access to materials, protection, a form of knowledge that accumulated differently in beings who lived long enough to watch civilizations rise and fall within a single remembered lifetime. A perspective on time and on the movement of the world that no human being, constrained to the brief arc of a human life, could develop independently. And the human smiths brought what they brought: the fire, the knowledge of transformation, the hands that could work at the scale where the finest things were made. It was a working relationship in every sense of that phrase: productive, ongoing, generational. The knowledge of how to serve the giant's needs passed from smith to apprentice the same way all smith knowledge passed, through proximity and demonstration and the long, slow absorption of technique that happens when a young person spends enough years in the presence of a master. But there was additional content in what passed between these masters and apprentices. Additional knowledge of scale, of proportion, of how to work at a size and with tools that no ordinary commission required. The long-handled tongs, the extended working range, the special relationship between the human body and the giant-scale forge that required the smith to think differently about reach and leverage and heat management than any ordinary forge work demanded. The man whose story we are trying to tell had absorbed all of it. He came from a line that had been doing this work for as long as anyone in his community could trace. His hands knew things his mind could not fully articulate. His body had adapted over years of the work to hold postures and make movements that would look strange to anyone watching who did not know what they were watching for. He was, in the fullest sense of what the tradition meant by that word, a master. And he was the last. He did not know he was the last when the knowing would have been most useful. This is the part of the story that the traditions find most painful to transmit, and the pain comes through in how carefully the fragments preserve the texture of his ignorance. He had signs. He had the kind of intuitive reading of the situation that a lifetime of work at the intersection of the human and the giant world develops in a person. He felt things shifting long before he could name what was shifting or articulate what the shift meant. The commissions changed first. This is the detail that multiple strands of the tradition agree on with unusual specificity, which means it is probably accurate. The nature of what the giant asked for shifted in the years before the end, from the functional and the structural towards something that the smith could only describe as the commemorative. Objects that seemed designed not to be used but to be kept. Objects whose form encoded information in ways that the smith felt rather than understood. Objects that felt to hands trained to read the intention of a commission through the weight and the balance and the finish of the completed piece, like they were meant to survive something. The smith asked about it once, carefully, in the way that you ask a question of someone whose answer you are not entirely sure you want to hear. And the giant answered him. What the giant said was not a comfort. It was offered as an honouring, the kind of truth you offer to someone whose service has earned them the right to know the shape of what is coming. But it was not a comfort. The giant told him that the civilization they were both part of, the civilization that the smith had spent his entire life serving in the specific way his line had always served it, was going to be taken apart. Not defeated in the way that civilizations are sometimes defeated, by being overcome by something stronger or more adaptable or more numerous, but taken apart deliberately, dismantled, suppressed in the way that you suppress something dangerous, with the specific goal of ensuring that what was suppressed could not reconstitute itself from the pieces. He told the smith that the people who were coming had been planning it for a long time and understood it very well. They understood that a civilization built on the cooperation between human beings and beings of greater scale and greater memory was inherently resistant to certain kinds of control. That the giant's memory alone, the simple fact of beings who could remember across centuries and who passed that memory to their communities, made it impossible to rewrite the past in the ways that the people who were coming needed the past to be rewritten. You cannot convince people that something never happened when there are beings among them who remember it. You cannot build a false history when there are archives that walk around and breathe and speak to anyone who asks. So the archives had to be removed. The beings who constituted them had to be separated from the communities that relied on them. The buildings that made the civilization legible to anyone who looked carefully enough at proportion and scale had to be buried or recontextualized or destroyed. The people who held the craft knowledge, the specific embodied knowledge of how the covenant worked and what it produced and what it meant, had to be scattered and disrupted and deprived of the ability to transmit what they knew to anyone who could use it. He told the smith that the objects he had been commissioned to make in the final years were part of a deliberate strategy of concealment, not concealment from the people who were coming, concealment for the people who would come later when enough time had passed, when the conditions were different, when there were people in the world who had enough of the picture back in their hands to recognize what they were looking at if they found the right things in the right places. He told the smith that craft knowledge does not survive in objects the way that historical facts survive in documents. Craft knowledge survives in bodies, in hands, in the physical memory of performing the work, which is a different kind of memory than the memory of knowing that the work existed. A person can be told that a certain kind of forge work once happened and understand that intellectually without being able to reproduce it. But a person whose hands have performed the work, even if that person forgets everything they consciously knew about what they were doing and why, carries the memory of it in their muscles and their reflexes and their instinctive understanding of how certain materials behave under certain conditions. He told the smith that the only way to give that kind of memory a chance of surviving across the suppression was to encode it not in any object that could be found and destroyed, but in the act of making itself, to make something whose creation required the performance of the knowledge in its fullest form, to make something so demanding, so complete in its requirement of every element of the tradition, that the making of it would constitute a transmission, even if the maker never spoke a word about what they were transmitting or to whom. He told the smith to make that thing as the last act. After everything else was done and the final commissions were complete and there was nothing left to do but wait for what was coming. Make the thing that required everything. Make it for no purpose other than the making. Trust that the making would do what the making had always done, which was to carry forward into whatever came next the knowledge of how the world could be worked. The smith made it. The tradition does not tell us what it was. This silence is deliberate and was understood to be necessary by the people who preserved the tradition through the generations of the suppression. To name the object would be to give the people doing the suppressing something to look for. And so the object exists in the tradition as an absence, a shaped hole in the narrative, a place where everything around it tells you something of great significance was there without telling you what the significance was. What we know is that the smith made it, and that the making of it took everything he had in the way that the tradition said it should, and that when it was done, he set it aside in a place he intended to be its resting place, and he did not look at it again. The morning they came for the giant, the smith was at the forge. This is one of the details that the tradition preserves with the kind of quiet emphasis that indicates the people transmitting it understood it to matter, not hiding, not preparing to flee. At the forge, working because the forge was where he had always been in the mornings, and because there was something in the act of being at the forge that was itself a statement of what he believed and what he refused to concede. They came at dawn. The force that arrived to take the giant was organized and deliberate and moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before, who had rehearsed this kind of operation against this kind of subject in previous instances, that the suppressed history does not let us examine directly. They knew what they were doing. They had brought what they needed. The chains were iron, which tells you something about their confidence and something about their preparation, because the iron chains that could actually restrain a being of the giant's physical scale were not improvised tools. Someone had designed them, someone had forged them. The tradition does not say who. The giant went with them. He could have resisted. The traditions that preserve this story are careful to establish that this was understood by everyone present, that the giant's capacity or physical resistance was not in question, and was not the reason he did not exercise it. He did not resist because resistance was not the point, because what was being taken was the body, and the body was not where the important things lived, because the chains could hold the body and could not touch anything else, and because violence in that moment would have given the people doing the taking something they very much wanted, which was the justification for further and more thorough destruction of everything the giant had been connected to. He walked, he let them put the chains on him. He walked with them toward whatever they had prepared for beings like him, in whatever the place was that official history has never seen fit to mention. But before he went, he stopped at the forge. The smith was there. They looked at each other across the fire, and the giant spoke. What he said in those final minutes is the part of this tradition that has been transmitted with the greatest care and the greatest sense of responsibility by the people who carried it forward through the generations of the suppression. Not because it was the most dramatic thing he said, not because it contained the most information, but because it was the most true. Because it was the thing he chose to say in the moment when he had nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect, and could therefore say exactly what he meant without any calculation about how it would land or what it would cost. He told the smith that the chains were theatre, that the people putting them on him needed a visible symbol of what they were doing, needed to demonstrate to anyone watching that the old order was over and the new one had the power to enforce its version of reality, and that the chains served that function regardless of what they could or could not actually contain. The theatre was for the watchers. The smith should watch the theatre without being deceived by it. He told the smith that what was being lost was not going to stay lost, that the suppression would work for a long time, long enough that the people doing it would begin to believe it had worked permanently, long enough that the memory of what had been would fade in most people to the level of myth, and then below that to the level of suspicion, and then below that to the level of a feeling in the hands that could not be named, but not permanently, because the physical world did not cooperate with the suppression the way the historical record did, because you could rewrite documents but you could not rewrite buildings, you could remove bones from a museum but you could not remove the doorways that the bones had walked through. The evidence was going to keep surfacing, keep demanding explanation, keep refusing to fit into the story the suppressors were constructing, until eventually there were enough people who had found enough pieces that the picture could begin to reassemble itself. He told the smith that the objects the smith had made for the archive mattered less than the smith thought they did, and the making of them mattered more. That the things the smith's hands had learned to do across a lifetime of doing them were not going to disappear just because there was no longer an obvious context for them. That knowledge lives in the body in ways that survive disruption of context. That some descendant of the Smith's line in some future generation that neither of them could currently imagine would sit down at some form of fire with some form of metal and feel in their hands a pull and a knowledge and an orientation toward the work that they would not be able to explain and would not need to explain, because the hands would know what to do. He told the smith not to mourn what was ending. This was the hardest thing he said, and the tradition preserves the difficulty of it, the fact that the smith did not receive it easily because mourning was the honest response to what was happening. And being told not to mourn felt, in the moment, like being asked to lie about the size of the loss. But the giant was patient with the difficulty of it. He had watched enough endings to understand that the instruction not to mourn was not an instruction to pretend the loss was not real. It was an instruction about where to put the attention. The loss was real. The mourning was appropriate. But mourning turned inward becomes grief that goes nowhere, and grief that goes nowhere eventually becomes the story you tell about yourself instead of a feeling you move through. He told the smith to let the mourning be what it was, and then let it go, and keep working. Then they moved him toward the waiting chains. He went without looking back. The smith watched him go until there was nothing left to watch. The tradition does not tell us what became of the smith in the days and years after that. It is not that the information was lost. It is that the people who preserved the tradition understood that the biography of the smith after the ending was not the point of the story. The point of the story was the forge, and the knowledge, and the covenant, and the final words. The aftermath was the smith's to live, and private, and not ours to know. What the tradition does tell us is that the forge continued, that the fire was kept, that the work went on in some form even after the context that had defined and given ultimate meaning to the work had been removed. Because the work was the work regardless of context. Because the hands knew what to do regardless of whether there was a giant waiting for the finished piece. Because the tradition the smith carried was larger than any single application of it, and survived the removal of that application the same way a river survives the removal of a particular stone from its bed. It changes course. It finds the space it can move through. It keeps moving. We are, in our current moment, in the phase of the reassembly that the giant described. The fragments are finding each other, the evidence that the suppression was not able to fully erase, the architectural anomalies, the skeletal records that keep surfacing despite institutional efforts to make them unavailable, the oral traditions that preserved their content through generations of encoding and careful transmission, the persistent wrongness of the official explanations when applied to the actual physical evidence. All of it is accumulating into a picture that is becoming harder and harder to not see. The Tartarian research community, the people who have spent years doing the patient work of collecting the fragments and mapping the connections and building the case from physical evidence, has established enough of the outline that the outline is legible. Not complete, not uncontested, but legible. You can see the shape of the civilization that was there. You can see the scale of what was suppressed. You can see the systematic nature of the suppression effort, and understand from that systematization alone that whatever was being suppressed was something the suppressors took very seriously. And you can see, if you look at the consistent detail across traditions that official history insists were entirely separate, the shape of the covenant, the relationship between the human communities and the beings of greater scale, the specific and sacred role of the smith within that relationship, the forge at the center of the civilization, not as an industrial facility, but as the place where the two kinds of existence the civilization was built from met and produced something neither could produce alone. There are people working at forges right now who do not know the history of what they are doing. People whose hands move in certain ways, who hold certain intuitions about material and heat, and the point in the process where the work wants to go in a direction the maker did not consciously intend, who experience the forge as something more than a production environment without being able to say what the more is or where it comes from. They are not imagining it. They are feeling the edge of a tradition deep enough and old enough that it survived being cut off from its own context and continued to transmit itself through the bodies of the people who carried it forward without knowing what they were carrying. The last blacksmith who forged for a giant made something in his final hours that required everything the tradition had given him. He made it for no audience, and for no purpose that the people who were coming would have recognized or been able to assign value to. He made it because the giant told him to, and because the giant was right, and because the making was the only act available to him that was equal to the size of what was being lost. The chains took the giant, the forge kept the fire. The knowing of that, if you let it settle, is the whole story. The buildings with the 12-foot doorways are still standing. The objects made to survive the suppression are still waiting in the places they were left. The skeletal remains that keep getting found and keep getting made to disappear are still being found. The tradition that wound its way through generations of disruption and concealment has arrived at a moment when the people who need to hear it have more access to the fragments than any previous generation has had since the suppression began. And somewhere, in the hands of someone who learned the work without knowing why the work felt like more than the work, the knowledge the last smith encoded in the act of making is still there. Not as anything that can be written down or accessed through the channels through which we normally transmit what we know. In the hands, in the body, in the pull toward the fire and the orientation toward the metal and the feeling of understanding what a piece of work needs before the mind has had time to catch up. The giant said the chains were theatre. He was right about that. He was right about all of it. What they took was the body. What they could not take is still here.